Welcome to PreVetted Podcast, a blend of tech and leadership. Our goal is to explore the journeys and stories of our guests, revealing valuable insights about engineering and business, and sharing them with our community. So today we have Kevin Dyck as our guest. Welcome, Kevin. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. Thanks.
Great. Great. So let's start sharing about who you are with our audience.
Sure. So I am a UX design leader. I'm based in Vancouver, Canada. Last few roles have been in remote work situations, so basically working from home most of the time for my home office. So I'm used to working with diverse, distributed teams. Um, I got in this position because I've been working towards leadership roles throughout my career. I've always loved the design side of any project that I've been on since before I was working as a professional. If there was a design aspect of something to it, that's what I gravitated towards. So um, feel very lucky that I was able to get into a career where that was actually my job.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's interesting where you can like do something that is passion that is a passion to you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then that kind of and they're actually paying to you to do that, right?
Yep.
So yeah,
Yeah, and hopefully the industry and appreciation of front end design and UX design has grown over the course of my career to match my career expectations. When I started, there was not that many roles out there. It's a much different scenario now.
I I learned a lot about design. And I was discussing this with Lino about like how much more respect I am giving to the designers
Mm-hmm.
from everything that I've been learning recently. That it's a blend of uh, technical precision, but also there is a human component,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's not a single answer. So it's not like math, one plus one is two. You have to, listen to what people are saying, right? Uh,
Well, sometimes there is, but also part of the job is to know when those times are and when they are not. Yeah,
right, right.
yeah. There's
Um,
things you know, and there's things you know that you don't know yet. So every once in a while, you have to answer a question, do a little bit of research.
so can you walk us through your journey from, starting in business communication to leading UX design teams?
Sure. Yeah, I started when the web was young. I started as a freelance web designer in the late 1990s, doing a lot of small business websites, that kind of thing. A lot of golf courses. Just kind of lucky with that. I got to specialize in something. From there, I ended up working for an IT wing of a major utility where I live here, called BC Hydro. And in that capacity, I was working on large scale enterprise websites and intranets. So that was the first time I was exposed to something like an intranet. That morphed into the role with Accenture, so even larger scale, a wider variety of projects, different utility companies. Still working on intranets and websites, but now we're working on multi-language websites, and geographically distributed and different kinds of internets with different needs and so forth. So all of those are bringing in new challenges. And that's when I was exposed first to usability testing. Until I was working there, I'd never heard of usability testing or the process behind it or any of the theories behind it. That's where I started learning about how to talk to users, what kinds of things you can and cannot do, what the value is of usability testing, and why you'd want to do it. Um, that was something that really was a turning point in my career, because that opened up all kinds of doors for
Interesting,
me.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry, I don't know if I fully answered your question there.
Yeah, I mean it's very interesting. I started my career as well, right in the 90s when
Hmm.
when the before the internet's bubble pop burst,
Hmm.
right, right before.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yep. When all websites were gray and all tables had big borders on them.
right
Yeah.
when where every browser, there was the browser wars.
Yeah. Oh God, that was a mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Microsoft had their own thing, right? So
Hmm.
you had to build the site 3 times so it would work for
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah. Everybody's trying to innovate, but no one was going in the same direction. Netscape was
Right,
the same thing too.
right.
Everybody was preaching web standards, and none of them were actually supporting the web standards.
There was there was no standard actually, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean,
yeah,
there was, but it was theoretical.
it was yeah it
Yeah.
was very basic. Yeah,
Yeah. I think the Mosaic browser was the only one that actually adhered to it, and no one used that.
right, right.
Yeah.
So can you expand a little bit on how to get into leading UX design teams? I
Oh,
think that's
sure.
the
Yeah.
part that you haven't answered, right?
Yeah. Okay. So from the utility space, I worked on more and more advanced jobs, bigger projects. Got to work on teams that were very, very large, like dozens of stakeholders in meetings, helping you make decisions about different things. That morphed into working on web applications. So the utility that our work was mainly for has a customer portal, of course, for paying your bills and managing your power consumptions, your stats, how much energy you're using compared to your neighbors and so forth. That's a fairly large web application. I was able to work on one of the earliest iterations of that. It's almost completely changed now. It's been
Right.
probably a couple of decades now since I was working on that, but the web app portal is still there. And the last time I looked at it, there was still a piece of it that I had designed, which was very surprising to me.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
yeah, that's got to go. It doesn't match the rest of the website anymore. Not my thing to deal with. So I'm going from web design and intranets and information architecture and usability testing now to web application design, which is a whole different bag of tools. Um, so that was really interesting. Got to do a lot of usability testing, especially on the web application design. From there, I went to a major insurance company around here. They do automobile insurance in the province I live in. And there I started as a senior usability analyst at that place. I think I had a couple roles there: senior usability and senior design. Moving into team leadership there. And that's basically how I got into the leadership role. Is I kept taking on slightly different roles that were adjacent to each other. Like usability is not the same thing as product design. Interaction design is kind of its own thing as well. Taking on different kinds of roles, different kinds of web applications that we're working on, including phone applications as well. And then gradually becoming more of a leader on the team, coming into team leadership. So then the next role that I looked for, which was in the financial area, I was aiming for specifically a leadership role on that team, which I got. So I became the team lead for the usability and accessibility team. We kind of adopted the accessibility wing um, as part of ours. It was a small team at first. We got to expand it over time until the point where I left. It was, I think, 6 of us on the team, and that's working on online banking kind of applications. It was really interesting. Yeah,
So your transition from individual contributor to team leader was
hmm
from what I'm hearing was very organic, right? It
kind of. Yeah,
wasn't
some of it is simply the kind of work that I was exposed to, and some of it was deliberately accepting roles that had more responsibility without the title necessarily, and then some of it was
right.
consciously going after roles that had the title that I wanted. Until I get to the point where now my most recent roles have been team management.
Because
Right.
I see that that's at least that was for me. I struggle towards that
Hmm.
transition, right?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and I hear a lot of people that they want to stay on individual contributors. They make
Mhm.
and they don't realize that they can make that conscious decision, saying, "I'm going to
And that's an
hone my
excellent
skills."
point. I did not see that as being a role. Like I said, I've been around for a while and the industry has grown with me. Um, in my
Right,
younger years, working mostly on, I'm in the province of British Columbia in Canada. So until um, 4 or 5 years ago, I was working entirely in this ecosystem in British Columbia. And in the early years, for sure, there were not a lot of leadership roles to be had. That is expanding, but now that everything is becoming more distributed and remote work, there's a lot more leadership roles available. But what that meant was when I was younger, I didn't even see leadership roles as being, frankly, possible. I think I was 15 years into my career before I ever had a manager who had done my job. That's not true, maybe 10 years.
right,
But I had a lot of managers who honestly did not know what we were doing. I hate to say it, but like
right,
that is true. So I feel kind of privileged to be in a position where I can manage a team that needs a leader who knows what their role is and why it's important because they need to be defended at uh, a management and executive level. Otherwise, something like usability testing for someone who doesn't know what it is, it's an easy thing to cut off the budget,
right.
right? That has to be
Dismiss as
defended.
right. Dismiss
Yeah.
as not important.
Hmm. I
So you have
still,
to.
yes, exactly. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Right. No,
But I
no.
still run into people who work on project teams that are run primarily in by developers or engineers that still don't understand why user experience is important or why they need designers. Still to
Right.
this day, it still happens. It's amazing.
Right. For me, it was recently, that I being able to appreciate more the
Hmm.
usability and the user experience work. Right. Recently, talking about last 5 years, right?
Hmm.
Where I was able to appreciate that role more, right? And the usability efforts as well, right? Usability and accessibility. I used
Hmm.
to be that guy that would dismiss it. Well, this is not
Hmm.
important, right? And I've been educated about the significance of
You're growing. You're learning. Excellent.
that. Yes, yes.
Good. Nice to hear.
What has been the biggest challenges in managing UX teams in different industries?
The biggest challenge, honestly, is learning the nuances of the new industry. Going from utilities to insurance wasn't that hard, although because the scale and the nature of the business is similar in that it's a large enterprise. It's kind of bureaucratic. There's all of how to work in an environment like that is sort of similar between them. The business itself, of course, is different. There's a lot of things to learn every time you switch an industry. Um, that said, the user experience part of it doesn't change that much. The user experience principles that we're working with that are applied to the different industries, those are the same from one to another. Like things have to be in a logical order, how you display content so that it can be grasped easily, especially on a form. Like if you've got a very long form to fill out, and some of these businesses had extremely long forms to fill out, how do you chunk that into logical pieces so that a user doesn't feel overwhelmed when they open that thing up? The principles behind that those are psychological principles. That doesn't change. So fortunately, I don't have to relearn everything. It's the nuances of the different industries that I've got to pick up. Frankly, a lot of acronyms in these businesses, and they don't transfer from one to another. They've all got their own acronyms. So all of that. When I was working in the financial industry, I worked for the credit union system here, and the ecosystem that they're working in on the engineering side, like linking different kinds of platforms together so that they all work in conjunction, incredibly complex. I saw it mapped out on a big poster. There's dozens of interacting pieces. I'm really kind of amazed that it all holds together, but it does.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But I have to know what most of those are to understand what people are asking me to do for them. So there's
Right.
that educational component whenever I switch an industry, which happens regularly. I don't want to be I don't want to be the financial usability guy. I could. It's not very interesting though. I don't want to make that into a career. I'd like moving into different projects.
So, have you had that eureka moment as an outsider of that? Uh, I don't know if this, you've been through that. I'm sure you have, right? Where as an outsider of a new, you're not familiar with the industry. You start asking questions,
Mm-hmm.
and people eventually like make assumptions of things, right? And then we're doing things like this, but they never question the why. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like we're doing it because everybody's doing it this way, right? It's been
Mm-hmm.
like
Oh,
that
that
forever,
happens all
right?
the time.
So
And
you come there and you're asking why you're doing like that, and then people are looking at you like what, and then it's like there's a better way to do it,
those
right?
those kind of things happen all the time. And you have to kind of pick and choose your battles. Like sometimes it's not that big a deal. It would be a better user experience to do it another way.
Right,
But that also means you're changing something. And if you're changing something, you're opening it up on the engineering end as well. And sometimes a simple request is more complex than you think it is. So just for strictly budget and roadmap reasons, it doesn't get addressed because it would interrupt too much stuff. Um,
right,
but it's a it's amazing how often things are done a certain way simply because they've always been done a certain way, and no one's ever bothered to check if that was an effective way to do it. It met the product requirements or met the technical requirements of the product. Um, and it's just assumed that from the user side that it makes sense because all the people working on it understand it. And the key thing to remember, this is a point that I have to make a lot, and it's the educational component of my job. That's a big part of the job and being leadership. You as a developer, or you as a product manager, or even just a stakeholder in a product, are not the user. You see things from a very different way than a user does. You understand things probably to a very complete degree, whereas a user might be coming in to use your product. Often they use your product once a week, once a month. They don't understand. They're effectively relearning your product every time they use it. So you can't take it for granted that they know all of this stuff that they need to know to get through the workflow that you put in front of them, right? And you don't
right,
know that until you talk to your users.
right, right.
Yeah,
It's an indirect representation of the users, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can't make. It's not safe to make assumptions about them. You kind of, and actually, there's the corollary to that is when you are talking to your users, especially if you're doing usability testing. When you're planning that usability test, well, A, make sure you're not biasing your answers by asking leading questions. But B, assume that you're wrong about things. Like if you don't walk into it with the assumption that you are wrong about something, you are not going to get good answers, right? Because you're that alone, that assumption that you are right. If you're trying to prove yourself right, you will find answers that confirm your belief, right? You'll
Right,
tend to discount the answers that disagree with you. Like you'll think of, say, only 2 people out of 10 had trouble with this, therefore it's not a problem. Oh, that's not true. 2 people out of 10 is a big number. We can fix that.
right, right.
Yeah.
Represent 20% of the,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
20% of say 10,000 users a day. That's a giant pile of users. and
Right.
by extension, revenue. Most of what we're doing is for business, so that means revenue.
Right. Right. So if you can put that as an option or an if, then you cover 100%, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Have you found different expectations on the users on different industries? Like we were talking about people are getting used to do things one way or a specific way in one industry, right? So do you see that same crystallization of behavior, so to speak,
Let me think about that.
in the users as well, right? Like you were talking about there are better ways to do things, right? But if the users have set a set of expectations, right?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a more complex question than you think it is. So one, depending on who your users are for a particular product.
Right.
So in my most recent role, we were working on a telecommunications product. There's two sets, well, broadly two sets of users for this. One is the administrative users who are managing a communications platform locally for themselves. And then the other one is the actual end users who are using the phone and text messaging and whatnot. The end users, you can't count on them to be expert users. Like a lot of them are um, infrequent users, or they're using it just to the point where it satisfies their need. They might be ignoring 80% of the features. On the administrative side, you have some people who can be expert users, and part of being an expert user is you're familiar with other products that are similar to it. So that means that comes with a whole set of vocabulary, which, as a user experience designer who's used to gearing things toward a very basic level, complex terminology or advanced terminology is something that I try to steer away from. But in a case where your users are expert users, you need the advanced terminology, right? So yeah, that makes a difference in how you're working with things, as opposed to when I was working with, say, the online banking kinds of things. You need to assume that 90% of your users are not familiar with the financial jargon.
Right.
Yeah. So you can't use buzzwords. You can't use technical terms. You have to phrase things in the way that users understand it. So know your users is one thing, because the users from 20 years ago are not the same as the users that you have now. That, like, the landscape has changed. Most of what people know about how to use your product, they didn't learn from your product. They learned it from using every other product on the web, right?
Right.
So something like a hamburger menu. If you look at usability studies of how well hamburger menus work, it's dire. When they came out, they kept getting used because there was a requirement to fit a menu in this space somehow, because it's mainly made for mobile applications. But people didn't understand them. Like, they would not think to click on them. Sometimes, even if, and I've done tests that had this result, even if they knew there was a menu there, they would search up and down the page until they found the link they wanted, rather than going to the menu. It was not a thing that compelled them to click on it. That is changing over time. So a hamburger menu is something that users understand better now than they used to. Probably still not a great pattern, but we don't have a better one, so we keep using it. But the flip side, something like the color of the text you use. And this comes to mind because it was something that we ran into a couple of weeks ago. A link that is not active, in this case, was being displayed in light gray text. Well, what does light gray mean in that context? Light gray to a user usually means inactive. Light gray in general is a color that you want to use when you don't want your users to notice something, right? It's basically, you need to have this here, but we don't really want people interacting with it. It's not a link. It's not a color you use for links.
Right.
There's a difference between inactive, which is a link that is available to you, and disabled. Light gray means disabled in that context. That is not something that's going to change. That's basic psychology. It's called Gestalt psychology, the whole field that we apply to this. And it's basically the way the user, people's brains interpret the things that are in front of them, how they fill in gaps, what certain things mean as a default basis. So yeah, something like the colors you use in your interface, basic psychology, you're not going to overcome that. These are things that people have learned at a very young age. Some of it's just innate. Another example of that would be if you're color coding something, you might want to use red because it's really, it's a bold color. It attracts attention. If you want to use that as something that it means start this process or go, well, great, it attracts attention, but it's also a warning color. So you're getting mixed signals there, right? And those mixed signals are things that, again, people learn that at a very young age. We're talking like pre-verbal. You're not going to overcome that. So just work with what people know.
Right. Yeah. And the gray link, it's more of a permanent disable, right? Versus temporary, it's...
Well, disabled is disabled, but honestly, if it's not something that's ever going to be active, it shouldn't be on the page. If it's on the page and it's disabled, there should be something that the user can do that will enable it at some point.
Right.
Yeah. If not, there's no need for it to be on the page. It's just clutter.
I find that I've been working with distributed teams in different countries. I moved from Argentina to Mexico, right? So, and I've been to different countries in Latin America, and there are nuances in the culture of how people do things, right? To give you an example, on or when we're recruiting and interviewing people in the US, there are different behaviors and different how people do things and how people expect things, right? Where they're very different than in Mexico and Latin America, right? So in Mexico, teachers send homework through Facebook to students, right?
Really? Wow.
And that, right. And that's something that surprised everybody in the US and Canada, right?
Yeah.
And when we're recruiting, people expect us to send them WhatsApp messages, right? And that's something that will be, unexpected, if you like. A candidate would not expect a WhatsApp message from a recruiter, right, in the US, right?
No.
Because that's kind of their personal space, right? So, but in Mexico, that's not only the norm, but it's also expected, right? If you send an email, they ignore the email, right?
That's they'll ignore email, but they'll take a WhatsApp message. Really?
Right.
That's amazing. But yeah, like the whole area of cultural differences is huge. Like if you're working on a product that is being used in many different countries, you have to understand how all of those different countries interpret what you're putting in front of them. Colors use especially can be vastly different in different countries.
Right.
Right. Especially, I touched on the color red. In China, red is the color for purity, I understand. Not an expert on this, but that's a much different interpretation of the color red than North America has.
Right. Right. And white is purity in
exactly
in Latin America, right? And I think in the US as well. Yeah. Yeah. That's why women marry white, right?
Yeah, international products. There's a bunch of minefields working with that. There's a lot to know.
Right.
How your text labels look in German, for example. I've heard people call it the double German problem because something that is simple in English can be twice or more as long in German. So you have to have space on your form to display all of that.
I work with I-18N translations in English and Spanish, and we had that issue, right? That text in Spanish requires more space, right?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
More, verbose. Yeah.
right? I didn't know that in German. I know that Germans have these prefix and suffix on adjectives
Mm-hmm.
and subjects, and so you kind of add the actions on, or well, that's what I understand. Right? Probably could be wrong, but you kind of add the actions as a suffix in the subject word, right? So
Mm-hmm.
uh, I understand that that is something like that, right? Where we have
Yeah,
the
and
the verb and then the subject, right?
yeah, there's also the formal versus informal way of saying things, and when you can use each. Um, and sometimes, like the formal way of writing something in German might be really, really long, but there might be an informal way that's a very short label. Unless you have a fluent German translator on your staff or available to you, you won't find that. You're stuck with the formal version.
Yeah, I work in a project where we were doing we were enhancing Google translations for
Hmm.
those nuances, between the business language, the informal language,
Hmm.
right, and how to say things, right, and then we will be parametrizing, sending parameters to translations, right. So I,
Okay.
I can I can say, meet you in 5 hours, right, or we'll close this order in 2 hours, whatever, right?
Hmm.
So that two becomes a parameter, because in one language you can have it, that phrase, that number in the middle or at the end or at the beginning. So the translation has that variable, and then it's called variable interpolation, and basically you can, on different translation you can put it in different positions, right?
Hmm. That sounds really complex. I'm glad I'm not working on that.
Yeah, I got into that. It was a rabbit hole, basically.
Yeah. Hmm. I believe it.
So, as a UX design leader,
Hmm.
what does a good design process look like to you?
Ah, okay. There's a bunch of different um, patterns, let's call them, for a design process. Design thinking is one, lean UX is another one. There's a list. They all share one thing in common, and that is plan early. You have to have a stage to your design process or your product design process that involves research, competitor research, industry research, uh, first order research where you're actually talking to users yourself, coming up with ideation and iterating on that before you get to the point where you want to um, hand that work off to final design and development. Um, Everybody kind of agrees that this is a good thing to do. Where the problems arise, where that system falls down, is how long it takes to do that, how far in advance you need to start working to do that. A lot of shops these days are agile, working in sprints, and those sprints can be a week, they can be 2 weeks. Well, how long does research iteration cost or take? 2, 3 weeks. Big project, it can take months. You have to budget the time to do that properly. And there needs to be designers in there, there needs to be product owners, subject matter experts, developers need to all have a hand in that. Most of it is on the UX design and researchers, but we need to be cooperating with everybody in that stage. And once you have a solid idea of how something should work, then you um, prototype it, test it if you need to, and then get to final designs for handoff. That's the ideal. In
Right.
practice, in practice, we often do not have the time to um, do that kind of work, even if you're not doing a lot of research on something. Uh, the design team needs to be ideally 2 or 3 sprints ahead of the development team. And if you're not already in that position, getting your organization to it is tricky because like you cannot just say all the developers take a couple of weeks off while design gets ahead of you. They all need to be busy, right? They
Right.
all have things that they need to deliver. So it's sort of something where you kind of try and build your lead over a number of months until you're far enough ahead. And then even then, there's always last minute requests that come in that are legitimately urgent, that need to be fit into your work schedule, that impair your ability to keep that lead. And sometimes things just need to be done in a hurry. That kind of messes with your process a bit.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But yeah, ideally you want to have time to do your research, and you want to have time to do iteration, which means you need to be at least two sprints ahead of development.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, and getting there, it's as you mentioned, it's a challenging process, right?
Yeah. So in my last role, we had a case about a year and a half ago where the roadmap for the main product that we were working on changed. And instead of doing things in pieces, we decided to update the entire application all at one time. That was a very abrupt change. We didn't have a lot of time to adapt to it. And that meant any lead, we didn't have enough of a lead already at that point, but any lead that we did had just evaporated like that. We're all basically now designing for things that the developers are waiting to start working on. It took 6 months to get a proper lead again, like any kind of advance ahead of the developers. Because again, no one can take time off. Everyone's got deliverables.
Right.
So yeah, that was a big hole we put ourselves in, or that we found ourselves in.
Once you balance everything out, it takes a while to get there, but once you balance everything out, everything goes smooth, right? And you don't have to fight with the system, right? Or compensate or firefighting,
Yeah, it's getting everybody to work in the same direction and
right.
have the same priorities.
Right. So getting to that design process where you have peak of efficiency, everything's going smooth, the level of stress is going down, as you mentioned, it takes 6 months to get there, right?
Yeah, it can. Yeah. If you don't want to rock the boat too much. I mean, there's ways that you could get there faster, but it would be, to use your flying analogy, it would create a lot of turbulence and overreaction, and can't remember exactly the word that you used, but yeah, you'd overcompensate and cause other issues.
Right. Yeah. You have to do baby steps. You have to make small changes, see how the system reacts, and then you make another change, right? And that takes time.
Yeah, it's a bit of a conservative approach, but it's probably the one that's going to work the best in the long run. In the long run. So
in the long run.
Yeah, it takes some patience. And so it takes patience, not from you, it takes patience from the people who are waiting for you.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I've seen you doing that magic. So, I have firsthand experience of, you being able to implement good design processes. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, how do you ensure that the designs you and your team create remains user-centered while meeting business objectives?
Okay. So, and the business objectives is there's a lot there. The one of the biggest things is we talked about timelines and roadmaps. So one of the business objectives is to release this project at X date, right? So as a designer, you want to make sure that you are not taking on more background research than can be fit into that time, or like if something is really required, then you need to get an extension to the delivery date that you're working on. But the business objectives, the main one that you're going to be concerned with is the delivery date. The other things are, of course, the product requirements, like what business rules need to be satisfied for this product. So that means the designers working on it. And this is mostly on the senior designers, but it's to some extent on junior designers as well. You need to know how that product works. Like what are the moving pieces that function in there? what are the possible error scenarios? What are the edge cases? How complex is this workflow? So that is something like a senior designer, a senior developer in a particular business is going to learn that stuff over time. Junior designers have to learn it as quickly as they can, but they should be able to rely on a senior to help them with it. So I want the designer who's working on a particular project to take a moment and look at it from kind of that bird's eye view and understand what is required, what are those edge cases. Because sometimes the product owner might have all of that in their head. They might not have written it down yet. So any questions that you have, ask them as early as possible. Then you want to rough it out in a wireframe form first, if you have the ability to do that. Then that way you can test the workflow, independent of the final design decisions that go into something. The workflow is the main thing from user experience design. So,
Right.
Now, if you're dealing with something complex, something new, something where questions have been raised, you want to have time in there to do a little bit of user research. So find the appropriate kind of research that will fit into the timeline that you have and that will satisfy the questions that you need to answer. Two key things there. Sometimes those are not compatible. Like there's very easy, quick forms of user research that you can do using products like Listna, which is simple usability testing. Like you can do one-click tests or first-click tests, 3-second tests, preference tests, that kind of thing. You can get very, very fast answers out of something like that. It takes a little time to set the test up, but not that much. But you get quick answers out of that. Other kinds of things where you might have a complex question, and I'm afraid none are really coming to mind right now. But you run into a case where you need to talk to users and see how they understand the problem that is set in front of them. That is going to require usability testing. And that is where an actual user is using a prototype of what you're building or possibly a live version of what you're building, and see how they go through the process of using it. Are they interacting with the right keys? Do they understand the terminology? Is the workflow the same in their head as it is that you're presenting? Like, you see the basic problem in the same way as them. That takes extra time, so you need to advocate for getting that extra time. If you don't get that, you have to rely on your experience, what you know about users, what you've learned in previous tests, and make an educated guess about it. But, and this is key, it's going to be a guess. As educated as it gets, it's not certainty. Right? So you want to make as few guesses as possible. Educated guesses are better than uneducated guesses, but it's still a guess.
Right. You're still making assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
And that's what an assumption is, really. It's a guess.
So can you share a time when a design you led had a significant impact on the company's success?
The one that comes to mind, I've worked on a lot of projects over the years, and I'm trying to think of one in particular. There was one, it was actually a smaller project at the credit union system. So the company I worked for is sort of like the back end for all of the other credit unions. That means we are developing all the online banking for them. We have website templates that they could use as well. And when I got there in, this must have been around 2012, 2013, something like that, we had a mobile website that they could employ. It was very, very bare bones. It was honestly 10 years out of date. It was something that really needed to be updated, and it was a completely different content base than their traditional desktop websites would have been. So nothing was responsive, nothing was fluid. anything like that. So I led a project where we created a responsive version of their website that would take it all down to a good mobile size, retain all of the navigation in there, and allow them to keep most of the content that would be displayed on a desktop site. And this was intended to be an interim product last 4 or 5 years, because one of the other projects that we were working on was a complete replacement for their front end and online banking websites based on a totally different platform. Massive, massive project. So that was going to be replacing anything that we did anyway. So that's one of the reasons why the mobile version of the site never got the attention that it really deserved. So I was the lead designer on this, and I worked with one main developer very closely and one product owner. And we got this delivered to our credit unions, and not all of them used it, but the bigger ones did, because they have the manpower to repopulate their website to employ this. As far as I know, it's actually still in use. It's way past its expected end of life, but it worked pretty well. So,
Wow,
and
amazing.
for those credit unions, that addressed the need that they really, really had, because they weren't able to just spin up their own website for this. They don't have the staff to build
Right,
something like that. And yeah, it was a need that it was an area of the product that had been overlooked for far too long, and something that they could deploy fairly quickly, and matched all of their current branding. Like we did not alter their branding in any way for this, because that's a big thing. Um, and yeah, no, it worked very, very well. I don't know how many credit unions actually ended up using it, but I know at least a few of the biggest ones did.
right, right.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, mobile was considered a second-class citizen, right? People would not think about mobile.
Yeah, it was getting to the point where everybody recognized that things had to be mobile, and
Right,
that's when you started hearing phrases like "mobile first
mhm.
design," right?
Right,
Um, so we're playing catch up for sure. Um, there was a widespread recognition that mobile had to be done and done right. It's just it was, when you're dealing with an organization like that, that doesn't matter how big your organization is. You've got a limit to how much stuff you can work on at one time, and that means stuff gets prioritized. And the mobile website was something that always sort of got the short end of the stick. So we addressed that, and we did it with, frankly, a very small, nimble team. It is a good way to work.
right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
As long as
Yeah,
like you've got all of the main players, design, development, product management, all working very closely together, that is the best model.
right, right. And
Mm-hmm.
if they give you the autonomy that you need, you can move super, super fast, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the earning that autonomy, it's a lot of effort, right? So,
It is. People have to have faith in you that you're going to deliver
right,
something good without their input.
right. It not
Mm-hmm.
only is articulating, like what you're trying to do, the whys, it's
Mm-hmm.
also building trust,
Mm-hmm.
internally, so people can give you that, autonomy, so you can go and do what needs to be done, right?
Yeah, and when you're making decisions, you need to be able to justify them. And some of
Right,
that is, basically through experience, and some of it is we did some really interesting usability tests on that one that came up with some um, really unique insights, especially around age of users. So any question that I got about the designs, I had an answer for it.
right, right. Um, this leads me to another question. That was I thinking about when you were talking about defending the team, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you balance that, right? That defending the team
Mm-hmm.
without pampering the team, like shielding the
Mm.
team from uh, keeping the team
Okay,
also
so
connected to the business
mm-hmm.
urgency without transmitting the stress that the
it,
management could. could give you, right?
That's an excellent point. So one of the roles of a leader on a team, and I learned this from one of my favorite managers that I had over the years, a fellow named Ivan. You as the leader are taking the stress that's coming from above, transmitting the important parts of it, like deadlines and requirements, to your team, but shielding them from the flames. Basically, it's important for the team to know that something is important. I use the same word twice, but you don't really want to expose your team to the possibly degree of stress that is coming down. Right, that's part of your role as a heat shield for your team. Now, getting back to your question, how do you advocate for your team and defend their position? One, know your product requirements as well as you possibly can. Take that and match it to what the team has produced so far. Make sure they are on track. If your team is proposing something that is getting resistance, make sure you understand the reasons why it's being proposed. Like, is it a design principle that we're going with? Like, that's something that would show up in a heuristic evaluation, for example. Like, these are things we know about design, like how to group objects on a screen to make sure people know they're related, things like that. Like, that goes back to basic psychological principles, use of color, that kind of thing. Good labeling. So make sure you're sound in your argument. You've got all your ducks in a row, and you're as right as possible. And if it's an argument or disagreement about design decisions, your research and your background should carry the day. One of the things that we always run into, and it's every role I've ever had in my entire career, is someone thinks they're saving time by just making a design decision, and everybody's going to follow it. And they assume that they're right. There's that assumption thing again, right?
Right.
When you're assuming, there's a chance that you're wrong, and sometimes it's a very big chance, and sometimes it's almost 100%. So your role as the team lead is to advocate for the approach that your design team wants to bring and the reasons why, and educating people who don't understand certain concepts. Education is a big part of it. Persuasion is another big part of it. So you take all of that, you take your team's approach, and that gets matched with product requirements. And one of the, like, going back about half an hour in the conversation, one of the biggest product requirements is delivery time. Can the thing that we're advocating for be developed in the time required to meet a release date?
Right.
And if it can, that should be the way we go. And if it can't, then you may have to give up on that one. You're not going to win every battle. But if it's important, it's important. And sort of tied to that, one of the big aspects of resistance that we get when we're advocating for certain kind of design that, like, a development team might not have thought of doing, is it's perceived as being extra work for them. And therein is another example where you need to do some education, you need to do some persuasion. If there's a straightforward method to meet technical requirements that gets a product out, and that would be very quick to do, anything that we're advising them to do that deviates from that path is, by that definition, extra work. Now, if the definition of a good product is the best user experience, then it's not extra work. What the technical minimalist position is not enough work, right? So you've got to bridge that gap.
Right. Yeah. And it's a balancing act, as we were talking about the airplane, it's
and like, ideally, you're not going to win every battle, like I mentioned. It's a total balancing act. you want the final decision, to be based on merits, not based on who has the highest rank in the discussion or who has the loudest voice in the room, because all of those things come into play. But for the sake of the product, you want to take those two aspects out of it as much as possible.
Right.
Like, yeah, like no one
Right.
should be doing something just because I say it should be done this way. I should be right. Right. And if I'm not right, I will alter my position. And that does happen on a fairly regular basis.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've seen players, people, like going through, as you mentioned, like, because I said so, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it becomes a very conflicting situation, right?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Yeah. Yeah. But then, I usually, choose my battles, and then, I basically say, okay, we can,
Mm-hmm.
if that's what you want, we can do it this way. But then, I
Mm-hmm.
can show, okay, it didn't work, and this is why, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Choosing your battles is a good way to put it. Like you still want to put your position out there and make sure that the choice getting made is made with the knowledge that, like, there's this way to do it that you presented.
Right.
You don't want to just say, I'm not going to choose that battle, so I'm not going to even suggest a better way of doing something. The person making the decision has to know that they've rejected this possibly good decision in favor of the quicker decision. And if you're agreeing to that, or if you're agreeing to that, you should be making the point that you are going to let this one go, just to show that you are the team player, right?
Right.
Otherwise, when you do object later on, it seems like you're a squeaky wheel. I'm not sure if I
Right.
explained that exactly the way I meant to.
Well, the thing is, if you get to, ego versus ego, right,
Mhm.
then that creates a conflict, right?
Yeah,
Whereas,
yeah,
if you choose your battles, then you can, avoid that conflict.
hmm
But then also you have that, what is the word? Not It's not responsibility. It's that duty to,
right,
to do the best for the product, right?
right. Yeah, you want to be the person who's holding up the ideal of the best for the product.
Right.
You also have to be willing to compromise, and when you are compromising, the person you're compromising with should be aware of it,
Right.
so
Right.
that you are showing that you can be reasonable and someone that they can work with.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the avoid the "I told you so," but rather,
Oh, never say that.
right. But
That's
rather
not going to
saying,
win you any
like,
friends. Yeah.
but rather show, like, okay, this is there's a better way to do this, right? This
Yeah.
decision,
Yeah.
uh,
Exactly.
and
Like,
and now you have the uh, the data to support it, because
mm-hmm,
either it didn't work, or you got feedback, or from the users, or whatever, right?
mm-hmm.
And then you can prove that design decision, whatever it was, it wasn't the best, right? There's a better
Yeah.
way to do it,
Exactly.
right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And,
Great.
sometimes it's just a matter of taking what you were going to design and fitting it into the backlog. And maybe it gets addressed in a future iteration.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Doesn't always. It doesn't most of the time, but I have run into cases where um, we agreed to fit something into a backlog. It'll be just handled in the next version, and it was. So that worked out.
Right. Right. And we're talking about shielding the team, so
Mm-hmm.
shielding the team from those type of interactions, so you can do those negotiations and
Mm-hmm.
agreements, and then you can go back to the team and say, hey, we're doing this because it's a intermediate step towards something better, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or it's a compromise. You use the word compromise, right? This is a compromise. We're going to implement it. We know it's not the best, but
Mm-hmm.
we're compromising, and then we'll try to improve it further down the road, right?
Yes, exactly. That happens on a fairly regular basis.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right, yeah, and keeping the team out of the politics of the of the all the key um, um, players. Then
Mm-hmm.
they
Yeah,
can
and you can't
follow.
totally shield them from it. Like the people that they're working
Right,
with directly, if there's a stressful relationship there, they're going to be exposed to that no matter
right,
what. It's the level above the people that they're working with directly that they don't necessarily talk to a lot. And that's where, frankly, extreme deadlines and harsh criticism comes from.
I see,
So,
I see.
yeah, you
Right,
don't want, like, if the vice president of something or the C suite has demands or opinions that are coming down to you, you don't want to share all of that with your team. That's unnecessary stress. It's not going to help them. You know.
right, right. Yeah. Plus, it's somebody they don't know. They don't work with them, and then
Mm-hmm.
the seniority in the organization that carries a
Seniority in the
weight.
organization. It does, and it creates uncertainty. It creates anxiety, fear, all of the bad things. Like take that message that you're getting from above and boil it down to the actionable items that your
Right,
team can do something about, and impress upon them the importance of doing it without the fire and brimstone that comes with it.
right,
Mm-hmm.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's that way they can focus on, in particular, with I've seen it with technical people that they are more susceptible to those type of situations
Mm-hmm.
because you know they're used to their trade. I call it tradesmen. It's not the correct word, but they um, and I say it as a technician. I'm a software engineer, right? So
Yeah.
it's you on the computer, right? You're not used to people, right? So that's another
Mm-hmm.
that's another skill that you have to develop, right? So
Oh yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Like a lot of people in IT are they tend to be on the more introverted side,
right,
um, which comes with a certain amount of sensitivity, um, and that's part of it. And also, if you have a well balanced team, you've got a good number of junior members on your team as well as senior members. Seniors have probably been around the block and they've been exposed to stressful things before, and they whether they know it or not, they've got the psychological tools to deal with it.
right,
Junior staff, this might be the first time they've been exposed to something like that from someone who's really important. Um, I don't know if it's really good for them to be exposed to it. You know,
it can be overwhelming for them, right? As you
yes,
mentioned,
it can. They might overinterpret it
right? They
and
are
and dwell
introvert
on it.
or they're sensitive,
Yeah,
and first experience of those type of works, and getting
yeah,
a harsh feedback can be
yeah,
overwhelming. Yeah,
exactly. And really, none of that feedback is on them directly. It's more on a team level. It could be on the leadership level. It might be
right,
on my level. If I'm not leading the team the way that is being effective for the company, then the
right,
criticism is directed at me. It's definitely not something that I should be passing on.
right,
Yeah.
right, and the and and giving them actionable items. What are things that they can do, right?
Hmm.
That's
Yes,
that's
exactly.
more valuable for them
Hmm.
without carrying the weight of the stress.
Yes, that
Yeah,
is very true.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. And I being on the other side as well, like being seen as a fear of authority, giving feedback, and then being
Hmm.
perceived, harsh. So even though
Yeah, it's
I didn't have that intention, but that was the effect that happened, right?
right.
So
So when you're moving up into leadership roles, something that you do have to keep in mind is there's two types of people that are going to be you're going to be working with. There's actually I'm going to make it three.
right,
There's the team that you are already with, and you've become the leader of. So you were peers, and now you're the team lead, you're the team manager, something like that. You've got a certain level more responsibility and authority over a team than you used to have. So there's a dynamic that you've got to address and be able to work with. The second group is your senior designers. In my case, it's all designers, so I'm going to refer to that. They have been around the block. They've got 10 plus years experience, I would hope. Some of them have closer to 20. They don't need a lot of hand holding. They are your resource to bounce ideas off, and you're their resource to bounce ideas off, and you will work with them to find a solution. They've had a lot of managers in their life. They've had good ones. They've had bad ones. Hopefully they've had good ones. And you're in that spectrum somewhere. I aspire to be near the top of that spectrum, but no, it's up to them how well that actually works. The third group is your junior designers, your newer staff, who are learning a lot more. They have not had a lot of leaders before, different teams, different managers and whatnot. They've not worked with you a lot before. So to them, they're coming into a new situation. It's all new to them. You're already there. So I've had some designers recently who joined the team very shortly after I did, but I was already there. So to them, I'm a fixture in the company, and I'm the manager. I'm not the intermediate designer, or the senior designer, or the team lead. I'm the team manager. That is a certain level of authority that they're perceiving. I tend to treat everybody on my team kind of informally, and sometimes that can ring the wrong way if they're not expecting it, you know? And informally, I don't mean like, I'm not throwing around insults or anything like that. Don't think. I just sort of having a conversation like this, somebody, could be a friendly discussion, and it could be something that they're just not expecting out of a meeting with their manager. Or, conversely, I may have to give them some kind of direction, like, you did something here that should have been done another way, and probably should have asked somebody about it first, for example. So course correcting a behavior that can be interpreted as much more serious than I intend it to be.
Right.
And like in most cases like that, it's not something where we're talking about something that's going to go on a performance review or an HR sheet or something like that. It's really rare that something gets to that level. I mean, if the same mistake happens over and over again, it might go on a performance review. But if it's something we have a discussion about one time, you might be thinking about it for another 2 weeks. I've forgotten it, or I've sort of, checked it off my to-do list, and it's out of my brain for the rest of the week.
Right.
It's a matter of how I perceive something versus how they perceive something. So they're dealing with someone who has authority over them. It's on me to recognize that they have a different perception of this relationship than I do.
Right.
Which is a really long explanation to get to that last sentence. Sorry.
Yeah, I was thinking when we're talking about this, I was thinking that we were kind of implying that the CX is evil, or was kind of I don't think that's the case. As you mentioned, it's more of a situation where they have a lot of things on their plate, and they see something, they say something, right, and they remove it from their mind because they saw the issue, they moved on, right? But for a junior, that can be perceived really harsh, right? Right. And the same happened, as you mentioned, like when you're a manager and you have 2 levels down of trainees, juniors, or whatever, then the same thing happens, right? The authority figure gives you multiplies that have a multiplication effect of that type of situations, right? And sometimes it's very difficult as a manager to see that for everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, eventually we're humans, right? So we're trying to do our best, right? So,
Yeah.
so yeah, and as you
It depends
mentioned,
on yeah.
it is our job to as a manager to see that and make
Mm-hmm.
sure that. But sometimes we don't, right? Because it's
Well,
we have to kind of put put on their shoes, right?
yeah. It's there's the different things that affect how that message gets communicated. One is how much time do you have to do it? Like you might have a lot of things on your plate, and you just
Right,
spit this one out without due consideration to how it's going to be perceived. Um, that can happen a little bit, but also really key is understanding the personalities of the people that you're talking to. Like we addressed, um, IT tends to attract a lot of people on the introverted side. Not a lot of extroverts are doing this job. Some, but not a ton. It's on you as the leader to understand the personalities on your team and how to communicate with each of those if you're communicating with them one on one. How is that message going to get across in a way
right.
that they are going to hear it the right way? There's a bunch of different personality tests that you can take that kind of color code people into different groups. I don't even remember what those are called now. Uh, but the idea is to get you to understand that people may perceive things in different ways than you do, depending on their personality type. Now, if your team is the right size, you can get a feel for your staff and understand what each of those personality types are. If your team gets to the point where you can't keep track of that very well, you've definitely got too many people on your team. You should be
Right. Right.
thinking about splitting that or finding a way to have team leads involved on the team that take off some of that managerial responsibility. I
Yeah.
find
I,
the best size team for a design team, 5 or 6 people is a really comfortable number. I've managed teams that have gotten up to 14 or 15, I think. Um, that gets complicated. And without seniors stepping into kind of leadership roles, that would be unworkable.
right. Right.
Yeah.
I I always think that the rule of thumb is more than 7. You need to start adding leadership roles within, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know people who I've worked with before that have gone on to manager or director level roles that I know one person in particular who has a director level role has had fewer direct reports than I did.
Right.
Yeah. It really depends on the individual organization.
Yeah. But having more than 7 direct reports to you,
Mm-hmm.
that becomes unmanageable, right? That's what I'm trying to say, right? That's where
Yes.
you need to figure out, okay, how can you split up that team into smaller chunks, right? And
Yeah.
having some,
Yeah. You got to chunk your
uh,
team.
right, right, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right. So I have 2 more questions for you.
Only two. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. What advice would you give to someone looking to move into a leadership role in
Mm,
UX design?
okay. Think about this for a second. I would say there's at least 3 different pieces of advice I could pass on for that. One is you've got enough experience, you've worked for enough people, you've worked near enough people, you've seen what good leaders look like and what poor leaders look like. Emulate the good ones. You can
Right,
borrow all of their ideas. It's not theft, it's inspiration. Um, and yeah, I still go back to the leaders that I really liked and do certain things the way that they did it, even if the team itself doesn't necessarily understand it, the why of it. But yeah, if there's good traits to be had in a leader, do you remember those? Um, the ones, the poor traits that you've seen in leadership, and everybody's had a bad leader in the past, um, don't carry those with you. And sometimes you internalize it and it can unconsciously come out. Be aware of when you are emulating poor leadership behavior and stamp it out as fast as possible. Um, like the nature of trying to get to a decision quickly because I said so. It might
Right.
feel satisfying at the time, and it might actually get wheels in motion and get you working. But the knock-on effect of that is you short-circuited a design discussion that should have been had. The people who are following your direction don't understand the why of the decision, and they need to understand the why. I'm a big believer that why is the most important question you can ask. So not disregard, but consciously dismiss the bad examples that you've experienced in the past. So the next thing is to be a leader in UX design specifically. You need to have a certain amount of experience. There is if you look at job levels in UX design these days, it seems like there's a notion that you can get to be a senior designer in 5 years, 6 years. It's not high school. You're not graduating from anything. Personally, I don't think you can have a real senior designer in 5 or 6 years. You might have some kind of person who comes out of design school or just has come into design and is a savant, and they are just incredibly capable as a designer, and they can grow quickly, more quickly than other people can. But a certain part of being a senior is the experience of working on a variety of scale of projects and number of projects, and working with different teams in different environments. Like you're learning from all of that stuff. So a certain amount of experience is required. And to be a leader of a design team, you've got product designers, you've got interaction designers. That's a slightly different thing. And that's when you're getting into the UX territory. Interaction designer and UX designer, in my mind, are basically the same thing. Product designer is a little bit more front end graphics focused, high fidelity design kind of thing. Not strictly true, but if I have to make a distinction between the two, that's how I would do it. You would have UX researchers possibly working for you. You might have accessibility in the mix. You might have content writers in there. There's a few other roles too, but these are the ones that I've worked with the most. Get as much experience as you can doing all of those roles. You really want to be able to understand all of them. It's not required, absolutely, but if you're going to be a well-rounded leader, you have to have well-rounded experience, in my thinking. So, and maybe this isn't the way to become a good UX leader. This is the way I got to be a good UX leader. I've done the product design role, done the usability testing, I've done user research. I've never been the accessibility guy, but I've had a lot of experience working with a very good accessibility specialist. And all of those things I've done at a senior level. There's faster ways to get into a UX leadership role, but if you want to be well-rounded, you want to do all of those things at a senior level.
Right.
That's my thinking on it. Now, someone who's only ever been a product designer and gets to be lead product designer and then team manager, I don't know that they would be the best person to be running a research team. If research is under your umbrella, is someone who's never done research someone you want running the show?
Right.
Yeah. So get as much broad experience as you can. I've been consciously trying to work on being a UX generalist since 2010, maybe earlier than that. So I get all of that experience with the eye on becoming a good manager level, possibly director level position.
Right.
Yeah.
What is the difference between, you mentioned product designer, what is the difference between a product designer and a product owner?
Product owner is someone who's doing the business rules for a product. They understand what the business need is for this thing. They understand. They should understand who the user is. They should understand what the user needs to do with a certain product. They would have a good understanding of what back end or third party features need to integrate with it. Um, the product owner is writing up the requirements for what the designs need to be then. In many organizations, the product owner is also involved in the usability testing aspect of it. It's not usability doesn't have to be on the designers to do. And ideally, you've got a separate usability testing team, but a product owner is kind of coordinating all of that stuff, and they're taking all of that from the design side and coordinating that with the developers as well. So, like, ideally, the ideal team triad has a senior UX person, a senior developer, and a product owner on it, and they're all cooperating to mold that product into the best thing it can be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it overlaps the UX design area in that there could be some usability research that they direct. They would also be doing probably user interviews and things like that. But it's a separate thing from product design.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, you don't, like you were mentioning that you're not an expert on accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
I I think that you don't need to be an expert on accessibility to be able to articulate, on the managerial level, the importance of it, and being able to identify when it's being done correctly or not, right?
Yeah, that's very true. Now, my experience of it has been colored by like how in depth I got with it in that one particular role.
Right.
On a design level, you want to do at least cover the basics, like color choices that have enough contrast for the user to understand things. Color choices that are not going to affect people with color blindness, for example, like
Right.
red and green in an interface. If you're using that for a cue for users, you have to have a secondary cue for the users as well, labels, icons, something like that, because in the most common type of color blindness, red and green appear as brown, the same shade of brown, right? So you can't rely on those things. Understand things like that. Font sizes, spacing on the page, not a designer thing specifically. This would be more on development, but how a user can tab through an interface. Like they should be able to hit the tab button on their keyboard and get from one important part of the page to the next in a logical order, right? Things like that. Then it gets a little bit more in depth using ARIA labels and understanding the VUCA specs.
Right.
And where those all are. But that's, if you're getting that deep into it, you really should have an accessibility specialist at your disposal.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, as a generalist, the way that I think of it is, you can build this vision of building blocks, right? So, you can we're talking about cars and planes. You don't need to know how an internal combustion engine works to understand the benefits of a car and the pros and cons of one car and another.
Totally,
whatever, right?
Yeah.
So you think of that as a box. You understand the significance of the role of the box and things like that, and you can articulate that. Then you can get more into details, but eventually that's where the specialist can come in and just
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you can get 80% of the need taken care of just by understanding the broad strokes of what needs to be done.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So being able to talk both the articulate the business impact and needs of that particular box for and being able to articulate it to the specialists, what are the specific requirements that you think will benefit the most for the product and the company.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, if you're bringing in good experts, then they're going to know what to do. They won't need hand holding, so they're going to have a
Yeah.
significant impact into it. Right?
Yeah. Here's another case where early exposure to the product is a good thing. I've worked on a lot of projects, including where I had my accessibility expert on staff, and a lot of projects address accessibility as the last step in development before they want to release it, and they think it's a rubber stamp, and then they can put this thing out in the wild. They don't understand that when it comes to things like keyboard navigation through your product or ARIA labels and things like that, the advice that the accessibility specialist can bring back to you might require significant alterations to the way you've architected the product. So talk to your accessibility person early and find out where those landmines might be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you leave it too late, what's going to happen is all of that advice is going to get put into the backlog and the product's going to get released in an unaccessible state, which, depending on what jurisdiction you're in and what the laws are there, could leave you open to a lawsuit, which happens.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. There's been cases where I don't want to say which drugstore firm it was. I think I know which one it was, but I'm not positive. They had just released an update to their website. It did not meet WCAG WCAG standards, and they were sued for it, and they had to completely redo their website. It cost them millions.
Oh, interesting. I
Yeah.
did not know that.
Sometimes these lawsuits get reported. Sometimes they don't. A lot of them get settled. A lot of them, it happens. And
Right.
like the United States has fairly strong laws about accessibility. Canada does in certain cases, depending on the scale of your product and who the user base is. Not scale of your product, sorry, the scale of your company. So, like, for example, when I was working with the credit union system, the credit unions that we were delivering to, many of them were large enough that they would be governed by these laws.
Right.
So they had to deliver an accessible product. And if they didn't, they would be open to legal challenges.
Yeah, it's in particular regulatory industries, right? Industry with stronger regulations.
Oh,
right.
Yeah. Anything government controlled, anything in Canada, they're called crown corporations. A company like, say, the Workers' Compensation Board is. It's not a private company, but it's not exactly a government wing. It's a government-controlled corporation.
Right.
They would be susceptible, or I keep using that word. They would be subject to these laws.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
In the U.S., you have vendors of government agencies. They
They would
require.
totally be subject to those laws. Yeah. And the point that I make to project teams when I'm trying to advocate for getting them to address this early is, of all of the advice that you're getting from your development team and from your PMs and from your designers about how to build your product, the only one that is legally required is accessibility.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That means that puts higher priority on accessibility.
It should. Yes.
It should. Yeah, it should. Right.
Yeah.
How can people reach out to you and connect with you?
Oh, sure. I have my personal consulting website. It's kdux.ca.
Right.
That's the easiest way. I'm on LinkedIn, of course. Emails kevin@kdux.ca. Simple as that.
Great. And we'll put that information on the notes as well, so people can reach
Thank
out
you
to
very
you.
much.
Right.
Awesome.
It was a pleasure to speak with you, Kevin. We had a
Likewise. I really
great,
enjoyed this. It's been fun.
great, awesome, great
Yeah.
insights, and